I have 3 minutes, so I will be brief. I want to present briefly the overall structure and some of the main recommendations and outcomes from the project called Preparatory Steps Towards the GMO Research ERA-Net, or PreSto in short. Some background and the objective that we wanted to achieve is, as said, a collaborative coordination and support action, so a very short, small project with a budget of just below 1 million euros. We tried to achieve everything that we set out to achieve within 24 months, which was a very tight deadline and which proved to be very ambitious. And our consortium incorporated 22 partners from 13 different countries, both member states as well as associated countries. And you can see that we covered a whole bunch of European countries, ranging from the north in Sweden to the south in Spain. Turkey was the associated country, as well as Switzerland. And you see there are many different member states that have very different views on the use of genetically modified organisms. And within the consortium, we also had a very broad range of different disciplines. Not only, as you will see in the next slide, on the scientific or natural sciences aspect of the project, but also in sociology. So what the topic asked us to do was to facilitate cooperation between European research funding bodies on the one side and also the scientific community on the other side on potential health, environmental and techno-economic effects of GMOs. And that meant that we had to combine both within the consortium, so we had a lot of universities and other research institutions involved, but also food and safe food and health organizations, as well as funding bodies and program owners from different countries. Like for instance the Ministry of the Environment and Food and Water from Austria, and the Ministry of Education and Research in Germany, and the Scientific Research Council from Sweden, for instance. And we were supposed to provide a basis for an exchange of information and future collaboration between those different actors by doing 3 things. Facilitating stock taking, so looking at what has already been done in GMO research and GMO impact research, especially by the member states, because the member states have performed and financed a lot of research. We already have heard from the European Commission that they spent like 300 million euros over the last 20 years on GMO research, and the member states have put also an enormous amount of money into projects. Then the second point is identifying future research priorities in this field, and also where member states can cooperate better to allow for complementarities in their approaches and to allow for synergies, but also to look at where gaps exist. And then finally creating a basis for developing future joint transnational calls, which would then be performed by an ERA-Net, being a network of funders from different member states collectively asking for proposals to a certain topic. So what the PreSto consortium then set as their overall objective was to map out and take all these different steps needed to create and successfully implement an ERA-Net. And I will go into a bit of a detail on what these steps are. And it's important to note that we wanted to cover all these aspects, so impacts, both positive as negative, in human and animal health, the environment, and also techno-economics and the wider society. And we focused ourselves on GMOs that are intentionally released into the environment or that are used in food and feed applications, because we thought it would not make sense to also incorporate microorganisms, for instance, that are used in industrial biotechnology, that are fermented somewhere to produce an industrially usable product. So in terms of overall structure, we had like these 4 core work packages that did the content-wise work. In work package 1, we looked at what the member states have been performing in terms of research, and that was built on the work by the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research, which had a small working group looking at the research programs of member states in the areas of GMO risk research. And we extended that and put all the data into the CADEMA database. Then we had the horizon scanning exercise work package that tried to anticipate what kind of GMOs are currently in the regulatory pipeline, which are under development by public research institutions, but as well as industry. So to ascertain what are the GMOs that we might be looking at in the near future, and like in 5 or 10 years horizon, because that is important to know in terms of what knowledge do we need to gather until that point in time when the applications really arrive in the EFSA office. In work package 3, we then try to mobilize stakeholder input on prioritizing the research needs and gaps that we have identified. So this was done using a Delphi survey and developing a multi-criteria decision analysis model based on the input that we received from the stakeholders to really make sense of all these different kinds of gaps that we identified. And this was finally then distilled into a strategic implementation plan for the ERA-Net, trying to figure out what are the options that funders could take for implementing such an ERA-Net. And this was then flanked and facilitated by the work package 5 on dissemination, communication and stakeholder engagement, looking also at responsible research innovation kinds of aspects for the ERA-Net and also for our project, and of course the work package on management. So very briefly, some key results, and I need to emphasize that are just highlights that I've taken out from that. All the results are public in reports and deliverables on our website, or will be available on our website in short time. So what we found is that over the last 20 years, the EU and member states have funded a lot of research, but mostly have been looking at the potential risks of using GMOs. So there's a lot of evidence available on certain impact categories for different GMOs, but there's a very strong focus on GM plants and environmental impacts. And there are other areas and other GMOs, like for instance GM insects or GM microorganisms that are released into the environment, where not so much work has been done. And there are also certain areas of potential impact categories where not a lot of research has been performed. So there's less evidence on animals and microorganisms, and there's especially less evidence on techno-economic and socio-economic effects specifically for the EU situation. There's a lot of research performed abroad. There are only few studies for the EU. And now if you consider that there are well over 200 different GMOs worldwide that are being cultivated, and many more that are in the development or in the regulatory pipeline, and that these are very many different GMOs in terms of traits and species. You have fish, you have insects, you have trees, you have ornamental plants, you have annual and perennial plants, and traits are all over the board. Of course, they're mostly plants, but there are also some arthropods. It's hard to make predictions, of course, about where they will be commercialized and when, and whether there will also be applications or uses with some portent for the European Union. And applications, what we think and what we gathered from the evidence is that will in the EU mostly be for food and feed and not for bringing them out into the environment. But nonetheless, there will be a lot of applications coming towards the EU, that's foreseeable. So some key results from what the stakeholders told us. Stakeholders almost unanimously agree that risks are important to be assessed. That's obviously and very clear, and I think that's nothing that we should doubt. But also the benefit side of the whole equation is important, because you cannot really make a judgment on anything if you do not consider both sides. And there are perceived gaps in certain areas for risk assessment research, but even more so for benefit assessment research, because not so much has been done in that area. And some challenges were identified. For instance, that it's unclear as to how stakeholders contribute to the policy process in that area. So a lot of stakeholders felt that they are involved in the discussions and also maybe in agenda setting for research, but it's unclear as to what the impact of that involvement really is. And it was also clear that stakeholders can contribute meaningfully to that, but it's not often considered in a right way. And another problem was the availability of secure trial sites. We have seen that in many European countries that trials with genetically modified organisms have been destroyed. And if you really want to perform that kind of research, being in an ERA-Net or outside of an ERA-Net, you need to think about how to make those available, those trial sites secure. And that might cost a lot of money. Research priorities that, again, distilled from the evidence streams, can be effective governance and regulation strategies, looking at how can we cope with all that is coming our way, but also what determines public perception on GMO issues, and how can we work with that in the context of responsible research and innovation. Two interesting questions that came along from the evidence stream were also, is there a potential for irreversible harm, either in ecological terms, but also in animal and human health terms? And other issues that of a more general nature, more horizontal nature, are that if you really want to address impacts in this area, it's of course very important to do that inter- or transdisciplinarity. That stakeholder involvement and participation is a meaningful and very important thing. And we have seen that a lot of efforts need to be invested into this to make this really meaningful and efficient. Capacity building is an issue, not only in terms of science, but also in terms of enabling stakeholders to take a meaningful part in the discussion. And then transparency and open access, which have been alluded to in previous talks as well. So if you want to go into detail into these results, you need to really have a look into the strategic implementation plan, where we are very transparent on where the evidence came from, what the strings that might be attached to that evidence are, and also into the single deliverables from the different work packages. And they will all be put on the PreSto GMO website for a date. I might have to ask Klaus whether he can confirm when that will be, but it's all finished now because we ended in August, and we have reported and submitted everything to the European Commission, and it's now up to them to say whether they are happy with what we delivered. And with that, I want to extend a big thank you to all the members of the consortium, to all the stakeholders, scientists, civil society organizations that were engaged in our project, and for you for listening. And well, I took a bit longer than 3 minutes, but I'm sorry.